Rain had a way of turning the city honest. It stripped the streets of their noise, softened the neon lights into trembling reflections, and forced everyone outside to move a little slower, a little more carefully. On that particular evening, the rain fell hard and unrelenting, as if the sky itself had decided to empty all its grief at once. Cars hissed past in silver blurs, umbrellas collided and apologized, and somewhere between the glow of storefronts and the darkness under a flyover, a moment waited quietly to change several lives forever. Ethan Rose sat in the back seat of his black luxury sedan, his phone glowing with messages he wasn't reading. At 48, he had everything most people spent their lives chasing: money, influence, freedom, but tonight, none of it felt particularly heavy or real. The car slowed at a red light, and the windshield wipers moved in steady arcs, slicing the rain into brief moments of clarity. That was when he saw them. They were walking, not hurrying, not running, just moving forward as if stopping was not an option. A man in a thin, dark jacket held the hand of a small boy whose sneakers were soaked through, each step making a faint squelching sound. Beside them, a woman cradled a baby under her coat, her head bowed to shield the child's face from the rain. Their clothes clung to them, heavy with water, and yet there was something unspoken in the way they stayed close together, as if they were guarding something far more valuable than warmth. Ethan's gaze followed them longer than he intended. His driver noticed and glanced in the mirror. The light turned green, but Ethan didn't say a word. The car rolled forward slowly, keeping pace with the family on the sidewalk. For reasons he didn't yet understand, Ethan felt a tightening in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. It reminded him of a time before boardrooms and private flights, back when decisions were made out of necessity, not convenience. The man suddenly stopped. He knelt in the rain, right there on the sidewalk, and tied the boy's shoelace with careful fingers, shielding the knot with his own body. The woman paused, adjusting the baby's blanket, whispering something that made the child stir but not cry. No one else seemed to notice. People rushed past, faces hidden behind umbrellas and collars turned up against the cold. Ethan did notice. He noticed everything. He remembered a night long ago when his own father had done something similar, crouching in a downpour to fix a broken wheel on a battered suitcase while Ethan shivered beside him. They had been leaving an apartment they could no longer afford, and his father had smiled through exhaustion and said, "We'll be fine. We just have to keep going." That memory had been buried under decades of success, but the rain had unearthed it. The car stopped at the next signal. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbow on his knee. He could easily look away, check his phone, return to the comfortable distance he'd perfected over the years. Instead, he lowered the window slightly. The sound of rain rushed in, cold and sharp, along with the muted hum of the city. The family started walking again, passing close to the car. For a brief second, the man looked up. His eyes met Ethan's through the glass. There was no pleading in that look, no expectation. Just a tired awareness, as if he'd learned long ago not to hope for help from passing strangers. That, more than anything, unsettled Ethan. "Stop the car," Ethan said quietly. The driver hesitated, then pulled over near the curb. Rain splashed against the tires as the car came to rest. Ethan opened the door, stepping out into the downpour without his coat. The cold soaked into his suit instantly, but he barely noticed. The family froze when they saw him approaching, uncertainty flickering across their faces. "I'm sorry to bother you," Ethan said, raising his voice over the rain. Are you okay?" The man tightened his grip on his son's hand. "We're fine," he replied, though the words sounded more like a habit than a truth. Ethan nodded, glancing at the baby, then at the boy's soaked shoes. "Where are you headed?" "Just forward," the woman said softly, adjusting the child against her chest. Something in her voice, calm yet fragile, made Ethan's throat tighten. He reached into his pocket, feeling the familiar shape of his wallet, but stopped himself. Money was easy. Too easy. He sensed that whatever this moment required, it wasn't just a transaction. If you enjoy meaningful, emotional stories like this, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more powerful stories to life. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the pavement. Ethan made a decision then, though he couldn't yet see all its consequences. He gestured toward the car. "Please," he said, "at least let me drive you somewhere dry. A cafe, a hotel lobby, anywhere warm." The man hesitated, glancing at his wife. The boy looked up at his parents, water dripping from his hair, his eyes wide and trusting. After a long moment, the woman nodded slightly. "All right," the man said. "Just for a little while." They climbed into the car, the interior suddenly filled with the smell of rain-soaked fabric and something else, resilience, maybe, or quiet desperation. The boy pressed his face to the window, marveling at the leather seats. The baby fell asleep almost instantly, soothed by the warmth. As the car pulled back into traffic, Ethan gave an address to the driver without thinking too much about it. It wasn't his home or his office. It was somewhere else, a place tied to a promise he'd made to himself years ago and never kept. He sat back, listening to the rain fade into a distant whisper as the windows fogged slightly. The family sat in silence, unaware that this brief shelter from the storm was only the beginning. Ethan stared ahead, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, and wondered when his life had become so safe, so insulated, that it took a night like this to remind him of what truly mattered. Outside, the rain showed no sign of stopping. Inside the car, an unspoken tension grew, because one small decision had already been made and another, far more dangerous one, waited just ahead. The address Ethan had given led them away from the crowded avenues and into an older part of the city, where buildings leaned a little closer together and streetlights glowed a tired yellow. The rain softened here, as if it too were running out of strength. The boy finally spoke, pointing at a mural half hidden behind scaffolding. "That looks like a dragon," he said, his voice bright despite everything. His father smiled at him, a small, weary curve of the lips, and nodded. Ethan watched them in the rearview mirror, noticing details he might have ignored before the careful way the man placed his arm protectively across his son's chest when the car braked, the woman's constant, almost unconscious rocking of the sleeping baby. These were not careless people. They were people who had been worn down. The car slowed and stopped in front of a modest brick building with a narrow awning. It was not luxurious, but it was clean, warm, and quietly dignified. Ethan stepped out first, holding the door as the family followed. The boy's shoes left wet marks on the pavement. The man looked up at the sign, confusion flickering across his face. "This is a community residence," he said cautiously. Ethan nodded. "I know. It's run by a foundation I support. They don't ask questions, and they don't rush people out." The man studied Ethan more closely now, as if trying to place him. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan hesitated. The honest answer felt too personal, too exposed. "Because it's raining," he said finally. Inside, warmth wrapped around them instantly. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and clean linen. A woman behind the desk looked up, recognition flashing in her eyes when she saw Ethan, but she said nothing beyond a polite greeting. She handed the family towels, blankets, and keys without paperwork, without judgment. As they dried off, Ethan learned their names. The man was Daniel. His wife, Maria. The boy, Lucas. The baby, Sophia. Simple introductions, yet each name seemed to anchor them more firmly to reality, as if being known, even briefly, made them harder to erase. They sat for a moment on a couch near the wall. Lucas swung his legs, fascinated by the quiet hum of the place. Daniel's shoulders sagged, the tension of constant movement finally loosening. Maria closed her eyes, just for a second, breathing deeply. "We won't stay long," Daniel said, almost apologetically. "We just need a night. Maybe two." "You can stay as long as you need," Ethan replied, surprising himself with how certain he sounded. Daniel frowned. Nothing is free. Ethan met his gaze. I know. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed softly. The rain tapped against the windows, gentler now, like a reminder rather than a threat. Ethan stood. I should go, he said. But I'll come back tomorrow. Why? Maria asked quietly. He paused, his hand resting on the back of the chair. Because I want to understand something. That night, long after he returned to his penthouse overlooking the city, Ethan couldn't sleep. He stood at the window, watching the rain blur the lights below. He replayed the evening over and over, searching for the exact moment when everything shifted. It wasn't when he saw them. It wasn't even when he stopped the car. It was when Daniel had said, "Nothing is free." Because Ethan realized then how much he'd forgotten the cost of surviving. The next morning, the rain was gone, leaving the streets washed and reflective. Ethan arrived at the residence early, carrying pastries and coffee he hadn't chosen himself in years. Maria greeted him with surprise, Lucas with open excitement. Daniel looked more rested, but his eyes were still cautious. "We'll start looking for work today," he said. "I can't accept charity." Ethan set the coffee down. "Tell me what happened," he said gently. "Not because I'm offering charity. Because I think I need to hear it." Daniel exchanged a glance with Maria, then exhaled slowly. He spoke of a factory job that closed without warning, of savings drained by medical bills after Sophia's early birth, of an eviction notice that came despite promises and appeals. He spoke without bitterness, just facts, as if reciting a list he'd memorized to keep himself steady. Ethan listened, every word pressing against something inside him. These weren't mistakes born of recklessness. They were the kind that happened quietly, to people who did everything right and still lost. "I had a job too," Maria added. "But daycare costs more than I earned. So we walked." Ethan nodded, absorbing the weight of it. "What if I told you," he said slowly, "that I could help you find work? Both of you. Something stable." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I don't want favors." "It wouldn't be," Ethan replied. "It would be opportunity." Daniel didn't answer immediately. Lucas looked between them, sensing the tension. Maria reached for Daniel's hand. "We can listen," she said softly. Over the next few days, Ethan kept his word. He returned with groceries, contacts, and quiet arrangements made behind the scenes. Daniel was offered temporary work through a logistics company Ethan partially owned. Maria was connected to a training program with childcare provided. Nothing was announced as a gift. Everything was framed as a step. But with each step forward, Ethan felt something unsettling stir beneath the surface. The more he helped, the more he questioned his motives. Was this compassion, or was it guilt? Redemption, or control? Late one evening, as he reviewed reports in his office, his assistant hesitated at the door. "There's something you should know," she said carefully. "About the foundation. About the residence you sent them to." Ethan looked up, the faint unease he'd been ignoring finally sharpening. "What about it?" She swallowed. "There's been an internal audit. And some irregularities. If this comes out—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Ethan leaned back, the city lights flickering behind her like distant warnings. Somewhere across town, a family slept under a roof again, believing they were finally safe. And for the first time since that rainy night, Ethan realized that his single decision might be standing on far more fragile ground than he'd ever imagined. Ethan didn't respond right away. He watched his assistant's reflection in the glass wall of his office, saw the way her hands were clasped too tightly, the way her shoulders were rigid with the fear of delivering bad news to someone who was used to controlling outcomes. "How serious?" he asked at last. She hesitated. "Serious enough that if the board finds out before we understand it, they might shut the place down." Or worse. The word lingered between them. Worse meant headlines. Investigations. The kind of scrutiny that didn't care about intentions, only about numbers and blame. Ethan thanked her and dismissed her, but her warning followed him long after she left. He sat alone, staring at the city, realizing how thin the line was between help and harm when money was involved. The next morning, he drove to the residence without announcing himself. The lobby was quiet. Lucas was sitting on the floor with a puzzle, his tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. He looked up and grinned. "You're back." Ethan smiled despite himself. "Looks like you're winning." Lucas shrugged. "I always win. Dad says I don't quit." Daniel emerged from down the hall, sleeves rolled up, looking more like the man Ethan had first seen in the rain alert, guarded. "Everything okay?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "I just wanted to check in." They sat together, coffee steaming between them. Maria joined them later, Sophia asleep against her shoulder. For a moment, everything felt deceptively calm. Ethan almost forgot why he'd come. "I heard back from the company," Daniel said. "They want me to start Monday." "That's good," Ethan replied. "You deserve it." Daniel studied him. "You seem distracted." Ethan considered lying. It would be easier. But something in Daniel's steady gaze made that impossible. "There might be a problem," he said carefully. "With this place." Maria stiffened. "What kind of problem?" "Nothing immediate," Ethan said quickly. "But I'm working on it." Daniel leaned forward. "If this is about us, we can leave." "It's not," Ethan said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "And I don't want you to leave." After he left, Ethan spent the rest of the day chasing answers. The audit revealed misfiled donations, funds routed through shell accounts he didn't recognize, signatures he didn't remember authorizing. It was a mess that threatened to swallow everything he'd tried to do right. And the deeper he looked, the more he suspected the irregularities weren't accidental. That night, he dreamed of rain again, only this time the streetlights flickered out one by one, leaving the sidewalk in darkness. Meanwhile, Daniel began his new job. The work was hard but honest, long hours loading and unloading trucks. He came home sore and exhausted, but with something he hadn't felt in months: direction. Maria started her training program, learning skills she'd once thought were forever out of reach. Lucas started school nearby, returning each day with stories and questions and a smile that seemed to grow wider. They were rebuilding. Slowly. Carefully. And they had no idea how unstable the ground beneath them still was. One afternoon, Maria noticed a man standing across the street from the residence, watching the entrance. He didn't approach, didn't speak. He just observed, jotting something down before walking away. She told Daniel, who tried to reassure her, but unease settled into their evenings like a shadow that wouldn't lift. Ethan received a call 2 days later. "We need to talk," the voice said. "In person." They met at a quiet restaurant Ethan rarely visited anymore. The man across from him was older, sharp-eyed, someone Ethan recognized vaguely from board meetings he'd half ignored. "You've been careless," the man said without preamble. Ethan bristled. "With what?" "With your conscience," the man replied. "You don't just move money without consequences." "That residence? It's a liability." "They're people," Ethan snapped. The man smiled thinly. "So are shareholders." Ethan left the meeting with a growing sense of urgency. He called his assistant, then his lawyer. He started putting pieces together, seeing patterns he'd missed before. Someone had been using his name, his reputation, to move funds under the cover of charity. And now, with scrutiny looming, they needed a scapegoat or a distraction. That evening, as Ethan drove past the residence, he saw flashing lights. Police cars. An official-looking van. His heart dropped into his stomach. He parked and ran inside, his breath shallow. Daniel was standing in the lobby, fists clenched, Maria pale beside him. Lucas clung to her leg, eyes wide with fear. A man in a suit spoke calmly to an officer, gesturing toward a stack of papers. "What's happening?" Ethan demanded. The suited man turned, recognition flickering across his face. "Mr. Rowe," he said smoothly, "this facility is under temporary review. We've had reports." "Reports of what?" Ethan asked. "Financial misconduct," the man replied. "Potential misuse of funds. We're asking residents to vacate until things are resolved." Maria's breath hitched. "We didn't do anything." Ethan stepped forward. "This is my responsibility." The man's smile widened slightly. "That remains to be seen." As officers began guiding residents out, Ethan felt the full weight of his earlier decision crash down on him. He'd thought he was offering shelter from the rain. Instead, he might have led them into another storm. Daniel met Ethan's eyes, anger and fear colliding there. "You said this place was safe," he said quietly. Ethan swallowed. "I thought it was." The rain started again outside, light at first, then heavier, as if mocking them. Families gathered their belongings, confusion rippling through the crowd. Lucas looked up at Ethan. "Are we going back outside?" he asked. Ethan opened his mouth, but no answer came. He realized then that whatever he did next would define not just his reputation, but the lives of everyone standing in that lobby. And somewhere behind the official calm of the suited man's smile, Ethan sensed that this crisis had been waiting for him long before he ever saw a family walking in the rain. Ethan took a breath that felt too shallow to steady him and stepped between the suited man and the family. "Give me an hour," he said. "No one leaves until I understand exactly what you're accusing this place of." The man adjusted his cufflinks, unbothered. "Procedures don't bend for generosity, Mr. Rowe." "Procedures bend all the time," Ethan replied quietly. "They just need the right pressure." The officer nearest them shifted, uncomfortable. The lobby had grown crowded with murmurs, fear spreading in low waves. Children clutched bags. Older residents sat stiffly, staring ahead as if movement itself might make things worse. Ethan pulled out his phone and walked a few steps away, dialing numbers he hadn't used in years. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but something fierce burned beneath it. He called his lawyer first, then a board member he knew owed him more than one favor. He spoke quickly, listening even faster, his eyes never leaving the scene unfolding behind the glass doors. Daniel watched him from across the room, jaw tight. Maria knelt beside Lucas, whispering reassurances she didn't believe herself. Sophia stirred, fussing softly, sensing the tension. Minutes dragged by. Rain streaked down the windows, blurring the flashing lights outside. The suited man checked his watch, impatience creeping into his expression. "Time is running out," he said. Ethan ended his call and turned back. "You're not shutting this place down tonight." The man raised an eyebrow. "And why is that?" "Because the order you're holding isn't valid yet," Ethan said. "And because the audit you're referencing is incomplete. Any forced evacuation now would be premature." The man studied him, then smiled again, thinner this time. "You're stalling." "I'm buying time," Ethan replied. Behind the man, one of the officers' radios crackled. A brief exchange followed, hushed but urgent. The officer's posture shifted. "Sir," he said to the suited man, "we've been instructed to pause until further notice." For the first time, the man's confidence faltered. "By whom?" "By the city's legal office." Ethan didn't celebrate. He knew this was not a victory, only a delay. The suited man gathered his papers, eyes cold. "This isn't over," he said. "Not even close." As the lights outside dimmed and the officers dispersed, relief rippled through the lobby, fragile and tentative. Some residents cried softly. Others simply sank into chairs, exhausted. Daniel approached Ethan slowly. "You stopped them," he said. "For now," Ethan answered. "That was enough tonight," Maria said, her voice trembling with held-back tears. Ethan nodded. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't see this coming." Daniel searched his face. "Then see it now." That night, Ethan stayed at the residence longer than he ever had, speaking quietly with residents, promising nothing he couldn't guarantee. When he finally left, the rain had eased again, but the air felt heavy, charged. The following days were a blur of meetings and revelations. Ethan discovered that the Foundation's financial issues traced back years, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and trust. Someone had been exploiting his distance, assuming his name was protection enough to avoid scrutiny. And now, as the truth threatened to surface, they were maneuvering to shift blame. Ethan's phone rang constantly. Some calls offered help. Others offered warnings. A few were outright threats, thinly veiled behind polite language. Daniel continued working, though tension followed him like a shadow. At night, he and Maria whispered about contingency plans, about leaving before things collapsed again. Lucas grew quieter, watching adults with a seriousness that didn't belong to someone his age. One evening, as Ethan reviewed documents in his office, his assistant entered, pale. "They're leaking information," she said. "Selective information." "To whom?" "Press. Regulators. Anyone who'll listen." Ethan closed his eyes. "About the residents? And about you?" The first article appeared the next morning. It didn't name names outright, but the implication was clear: a wealthy benefactor, questionable charities, families caught in the middle. By afternoon, reporters gathered outside Ethan's building. Cameras flashed. Questions were shouted. Ethan didn't answer. He went straight to the residence instead, ignoring calls from his public relations team. When he arrived, he found Daniel packing a bag. "We can't do this again," Daniel said. "We won't wait to be pushed out." Ethan felt a sharp pang of guilt. "I can find you somewhere else. Something permanent." Daniel shook his head. "You don't understand. It's not about the roof. It's about trust." Maria stood in the doorway, Sophia on her hip. "We believed you," she said quietly. "I know," Ethan replied. "And I won't let this end the same way it began." Daniel zipped the bag, his movements precise. Promises are easy when you're not the one standing in the rain. Ethan had no immediate response. He realized then how much power he held and how useless it was without certainty. That night, a message arrived on Ethan's phone from an unknown number. "Stop digging, or the families pay the price." Ethan stared at the screen, anger and fear colliding. He thought of Lucas's quiet eyes, of Maria's steady hands, of Daniel's worn resolve. He thought of the rain, of the moment he'd decided to stop his car. He made another decision. The next morning, Ethan held a press conference. Against the advice of nearly everyone around him, he spoke openly about the Foundation, about the audit, about his own failures to oversee what bore his name. He took responsibility where it was due and refused to deflect blame onto those he'd tried to help. Reactions were swift and divided. Some praised his honesty. Others sharpened their knives. Behind the scenes, pressure intensified. Deals were offered, silence in exchange for compliance. Ethan refused them all. Late that evening, as he drove toward the residence once more, his phone rang. It was Daniel. "They're here again," Daniel said, voice tight. "Different people. No uniforms." Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Stay inside," he said. "I'm coming." The rain began to fall once more, heavier this time, pounding the windshield as if urging him to hurry. He knew, with a clarity that scared him, that whatever awaited him at the end of that drive would test not just his wealth or influence, but the very reason he'd chosen to stop that night at all. Ethan drove faster than he ever had, ignoring the cautious voice in his head that reminded him of risks and consequences. The rain blurred the road into streaks of gray, streetlights stretching like wounded stars. With every mile, the message echoed in his mind: the families pay the price. He realized now that this had never been just about money. It was about power, about who decided which lives could be pushed aside quietly. When he reached the residence, he didn't park properly. He left the car half blocking the curb and ran inside. The lobby lights were on, but the place felt wrong, too quiet, like a held breath. Two men stood near the desk, dressed plainly, their posture relaxed in a way that suggested rehearsed confidence. They turned as Ethan entered. "Mr. Rowe," one of them said, smiling without warmth. "We were hoping you'd show up." Daniel stood a few steps behind them, tense, his arms slightly out as if shielding Maria and the children. Maria clutched Sophia, Lucas pressed against her side, his small fingers knotted in her coat. "What do you want?" Ethan asked. "To talk," the man replied. "Privately." Ethan shook his head. "Anything you have to say, you can say here." The man's smile thinned. "This doesn't concern them." "It concerns everyone here," Ethan said. "If you have business with me, be clear." The second man stepped forward. "You're making things difficult. The foundation's problems could disappear. The residence stays open. Families stay safe. All you have to do is stop pushing." Ethan laughed softly, incredulously. "You think I don't know what this is? You've been stealing, hiding behind my name, and now you want me quiet." "You want to be careful with accusations," the first man said calmly. "Careless words have consequences." Daniel took a step closer to Ethan. "We'll leave," he said, "if that's what this takes." Ethan turned to him sharply. "No." Maria's voice shook. "Ethan, please. We can't." Ethan raised a hand gently. "I won't let them scare you into disappearing." The men exchanged a look. "Then you leave us no choice," one said. Before Ethan could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Actually, they do." Everyone turned. A woman stood in the doorway, rain dripping from her coat, a badge visible at her waist. Behind her were two uniformed officers. "City Fraud Division," she said. "We've been following a trail that led straight here." The men stiffened. "This is unnecessary," one said quickly. "On the contrary," she replied. "Your timing couldn't be better." The officers moved in, firm but controlled. The men protested, then fell silent as handcuffs clicked into place. The lobby exhaled as if the air itself had been released. Ethan felt his knees weaken slightly. He leaned against the wall, adrenaline fading into exhaustion. Daniel stared, disbelief etched across his face. Lucas peeked out from behind Maria, eyes wide. The woman approached Ethan. "Mr. Rowe, we'll need a statement. And access to your records." "You'll have everything," Ethan said. "Whatever it takes." As the men were led away, the rain outside eased again, leaving only the soft drip from the awning. The officers departed shortly after, promising protection and follow-up. The residence settled into an uneasy calm. Later, Ethan sat with Daniel and Maria in the small common room. Lucas had fallen asleep curled against Maria's side. Sophia breathed softly, finally at peace. "You didn't have to do this," Daniel said quietly. "You could have walked away." Ethan stared at his hands. "I almost did. That night, in the car. It would have been easier." "But you didn't," Maria said. Ethan looked up. "I don't know if that makes me brave or foolish." Daniel gave a tired smile. Sometimes they're the same thing. In the days that followed, the truth unraveled quickly. Arrests were made. Accounts frozen. The Foundation's books were opened fully, painfully. Ethan's name filled headlines again, this time alongside words like whistleblower and accountability. His board demanded answers. Investors panicked. Deals dissolved overnight. Ethan lost more in that week than he had in years. Contracts vanished. Partnerships ended. Friends stopped calling. But the residence stayed open. Daniel kept his job. Maria completed her training. Lucas laughed again, loudly, without checking the adults first. Sophia learned to sleep through the night. One evening, Ethan visited the residence quietly, without cameras or announcements. Daniel found him in the courtyard, staring up at a patch of clear sky between buildings. "They say you're in trouble," Daniel said. Ethan nodded. "Probably. Do you regret it?" Ethan considered the question carefully. "Ask me again in a year." Daniel chuckled softly. "Fair enough." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Daniel spoke again. "There's something I never told you. That night we were walking in the rain. We weren't just looking for shelter. We were deciding whether to keep going at all." Ethan turned to him sharply. Daniel met his gaze, unflinching. "You stopping the car," Daniel continued, "that mattered more than you know." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He nodded once, unable to speak. From inside, Maria called Daniel's name. He turned, then paused. "Whatever happens to you," he said, "we won't forget." As Daniel walked away, Ethan remained where he was, listening to the city settle around him. He knew the storm wasn't over. Not for him, not for the Foundation, not for the world that allowed such things to happen quietly. But for the first time in a long while, he felt certain that stopping that night had been the beginning of something irreversible. And somewhere deep within the systems he had challenged, forces were already shifting, preparing their next move. The next move came quietly, disguised as order. Ethan learned about it on a gray morning when his lawyer arrived unannounced, face tight, briefcase untouched. "They're calling an emergency board session," she said. "They want to suspend you." Ethan didn't look surprised. He had been expecting this shape of retaliation, even if not its timing. On what grounds? Negligence. Reputational damage. Abuse of authority. She hesitated. And something else. What? "They're suggesting that your involvement with the residents wasn't altruistic. That it was strategic." Ethan let out a slow breath. Strategic for what? To build a public narrative. To distract from larger failures. She met his eyes. "They're going to paint you as calculating, not compassionate." Ethan almost smiled. It was impressive, really, how easily truth could be bent when enough money leaned on it. "When is the meeting?" "Tomorrow." The news spread faster than he expected. By afternoon, commentators were debating his motives. Some praised him as a rare example of accountability. Others questioned why a man of his wealth would insert himself so deeply into the lives of struggling families unless he had something to gain. At the residence, the mood shifted again. Daniel felt it first, an unease in the way people spoke more quietly when Ethan's name came up, the way staff avoided speculation but couldn't hide concern. Maria noticed it in the pauses between sentences, the questions left unfinished. That evening, Daniel sat with Maria on the edge of their bed. Lucas was drawing on the floor, Sophia asleep nearby. "If he goes down," Daniel said, "what happens to this place?" Maria didn't answer immediately. She watched Lucas carefully color inside the lines, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I don't know," she said finally. "But I know we can't pretend we don't care." Daniel nodded. "We owe him honesty." The next day, Ethan sat alone at the long conference table, the city stretching endlessly behind the glass. The board members joined one by one, faces carefully neutral. The chair cleared his throat. "Ethan," he began, "this is difficult." "It usually is," Ethan replied. They spoke for nearly 2 hours. Accusations dressed as concerns. Sympathy laced with warnings. Ethan listened, answered when necessary, refused to apologize for things he had not done. When it ended, he was asked to step out while they deliberated. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, watching clouds slide across the sky. He thought of the rain, of a boy's soaked shoes, of a decision made without calculation. When the door opened again, the chair avoided his eyes. "Effective immediately," he said. "You're suspended from all operational roles pending further investigation." Ethan nodded once. Understood. Outside, cameras waited. Ethan didn't stop for them. He drove instead to the residence, parking farther away this time, walking the last block under a sky that threatened rain but held back. Daniel saw him first. "You're early," he said. "I won't be coming as often," Ethan replied. Daniel stiffened. "Is it over?" "No," Ethan said. "But it's changing." They walked together through the courtyard. Ethan explained what had happened, plainly, without drama. Daniel listened, jaw tight. "You did the right thing," Daniel said when Ethan finished. "That's not what the board thinks." Daniel shrugged. The board wasn't there that night. Inside, Maria poured tea. She listened quietly, then set the cups down with care. "If they take this place away," she said, "we'll manage. We've learned how." Ethan felt a familiar twist in his chest. "I don't want managing to be your only option." That night, after Ethan left, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat at the small desk by the window, staring at a blank screen. Then, slowly, he began to write. He wrote about the factory, about the eviction notice, about the rain, about a man who stopped his car when no one else did. He wrote without anger, without exaggeration, just truth as he had lived it. When he finished, he hesitated only a moment before clicking publish. By morning, the post had been shared thousands of times. By noon, reporters were calling not Ethan, but Daniel. At first, Daniel refused. Then he remembered Ethan's words, "Stop hiding." So he agreed to one interview. Then another. Maria worried, but Daniel spoke carefully, never asking for sympathy, never accusing. He simply told their story. The narrative shifted. Questions arose not about Ethan's motives, but about the systems that had allowed corruption to hide behind charity for so long. About why accountability was treated as a liability. The board noticed. So did regulators. Ethan watched it unfold from a distance, his phone buzzing constantly. When Daniel called him, his voice was tense. "I hope I didn't make things worse." Ethan laughed softly. "You may have made them impossible to ignore." But backlash followed swiftly. Anonymous comments turned cruel. Someone leaked Daniel's employment history, twisting gaps into accusations. A letter arrived at the residence, unsigned, warning residents not to forget their place. Fear crept back in. One evening, as Daniel locked the door, he noticed a car idling across the street, headlights off. It drove away when he looked directly at it. He didn't tell Maria. Not yet. Ethan, meanwhile, received another message from an unknown number. "You're not in control anymore." He stared at the screen, feeling a strange calm settle over him. Control, he realized, had never really been his. Not that night. Not now. The rain finally fell again, hard and sudden, drenching the streets without warning. Ethan stood by his window, watching people hurry for cover, umbrellas blooming like dark flowers. Somewhere across the city, a family slept under a roof that existed because of a single choice. And somewhere else, Forces that thrived in silence were deciding how to reclaim it. Ethan turned from the window, already moving, knowing that the next step he took would demand more than money, more than reputation. It would demand that he keep choosing to stop. Ethan stopped answering messages that night. He silenced his phone, changed into an old jacket he hadn't worn in years, and left his apartment on foot. The city felt different when he moved through it without a driver or schedule, its sounds sharper, its faces less filtered. Rainwater pooled along the sidewalks, reflecting fragments of light and shadow. He walked without destination for nearly an hour, letting the noise settle inside him until a thought took shape, clear and stubborn. If control had never been his, then leverage might still be. The next morning, he met with his lawyer again, not in an office but in a small cafe near the river. "I want to separate myself from everything," Ethan said. "Not publicly, legally." She frowned. "You're already suspended." "I mean everything," he replied. "Trusts, holdings, any structure that can be weaponized. That would expose you." "That's the point." She studied him for a long moment. "Once you do this, there's no reversing it quietly." "I'm not looking for quiet." While papers began moving behind the scenes, Daniel noticed changes around the residence. Staff from the city visited more often, asking questions, checking files. Some were polite, others distant. The sense of being watched intensified. Daniel began varying his routes to work. Maria kept the curtains closed longer than usual. One afternoon, Lucas came home upset. "A kid said we live in a charity house," he mumbled, eyes downcast. Maria knelt beside him. "What did you say?" "I said it's our house." She hugged him tightly, holding on a little longer than necessary. That evening, Ethan arrived unexpectedly. He looked tired, thinner somehow, but his eyes were focused. "I need to talk to you," he said to Daniel. They walked outside despite the chill. "I'm stepping away from the foundation completely," Ethan said. "I'm also opening everything I own to independent review." Daniel frowned. "Why would you do that?" "Because sunlight scares the right people," Ethan replied. "And because if they're going to come after you, I want them to have to walk through me first." Daniel shook his head. "This is getting dangerous." "It already was," Ethan said. "We just didn't know how much." 2 days later, the first legal filing became public. Headlines followed quickly, sharper than before. Ethan's net worth dropped overnight as markets reacted. Analysts called it reckless. Social media called it performative. Regulators called it unprecedented. The board called it betrayal. At the residence, a notice was posted, a temporary freeze on certain services pending review. Panic rippled through the halls. Meetings were held behind closed doors. No one used the word closure, but it hovered unspoken. That night, the idling car returned. Daniel noticed it again while taking out the trash. Same model. Same place. This time, it didn't drive away immediately. A window rolled down halfway. A man inside raised a phone, the screen glowing briefly, then dark again. Daniel went inside without running. He locked the door and leaned against it, heart pounding. He told Maria then. She listened silently, then nodded once. "We'll be ready," she said, though neither of them knew what that meant. The next morning, Ethan received a package at his door. No return address. Inside was a single document, a draft injunction targeting the residents, citing safety concerns, zoning issues, procedural violations, everything vague, everything damning. Attached was a note with 4 words written neatly, "This ends tonight." Ethan didn't hesitate. He called the City Fraud Division contact directly. Then he called his lawyer. Then he called Daniel. "They're moving faster," Ethan said. "If they succeed, the residence will be emptied within hours." Daniel closed his eyes. "What do we do?" "We make noise," Ethan replied. "Real noise." By afternoon, reporters gathered again, but this time, not outside Ethan's building. They stood in front of the residence. Cameras lined the sidewalk. Residents watched from windows, fear and curiosity mixing. Ethan arrived openly, stepping into view. Daniel followed him out, Maria beside him, Sophia in her arms, Lucas holding Daniel's hand. Ethan spoke first. Not from a podium, not with prepared notes. He spoke plainly, naming names, outlining tactics, explaining how pressure worked in quiet ways. He admitted mistakes. He drew lines clearly. Daniel spoke next. He didn't ask for pity. He asked questions. Why were families treated like liabilities? Why was shelter conditional on silence? Why did accountability feel like an attack? Maria didn't speak, but her presence said enough. The crowd grew. Passers-by stopped. Phones lifted. The story spread live, uncontrolled. Across the street, the idling car was gone. That evening, as dusk settled, a city official arrived with new paperwork. The injunction was delayed pending further review. Temporary protections were granted. Not permanent but breathing room. Residents cheered softly, cautiously. No one trusted relief anymore. Ethan stayed late, sitting on the steps as the crowd dispersed. Daniel joined him. "You're burning bridges," Daniel said. Ethan nodded. "I know. Why keep going?" Ethan watched Lucas chase a puddle with a stick, laughing as water splashed his shoes. "Because stopping once changed everything," he said. "And because stopping again would mean pretending I don't see it anymore." As night deepened, phones buzzed again. Messages came from unexpected places, former partners, quiet allies, people who'd been watching from a distance, waiting to see who would blink first. Some offered support. Others offered warnings. One message stood out, sent from a number Ethan recognized but hadn't seen in years. "We need to talk. You're stepping into something bigger than you think." Ethan looked at the glowing screen, then at the building behind him, at the families inside trying to sleep despite the uncertainty. He typed a reply with steady hands. Then he stood, knowing the next conversation wouldn't be about money or image, but about lines that once crossed could never be redrawn. The meeting happened in a place without windows, where the air felt recycled and heavy with decisions made long before anyone entered the room. Ethan sat across from people whose names never appeared in headlines, whose influence flowed quietly through policies, budgets, and silence. They spoke carefully, almost kindly, explaining how systems worked, how disruption had consequences, how stories like his were supposed to end with a settlement, an apology, a return to order. Ethan listened until they finished. Then he stood. "I stopped my car because a child's shoes were soaked through," he said calmly. "Not because I wanted to dismantle anything. But once you see how easily lives are discarded for convenience, you can't unsee it. You're right about one thing, I did step into something bigger. But so did you." There was a pause, the kind that stretches just long enough to reveal uncertainty. They realized then that Ethan wasn't negotiating for himself. He had already lost what they could take from him. Outside, the city waited. The weeks that followed were not kind to Ethan's reputation or finances. He resigned formally from every board, liquidated assets under public scrutiny, and cooperated fully with investigations that dragged on relentlessly. Commentators moved on, as they always did, chasing fresher outrage. Ethan became a cautionary tale in business schools, a footnote in articles about overreach. But something else was happening at the same time, quieter and far more dangerous to the old order. The residence was not shut down. Instead, it was transferred first temporarily, then permanently into a city-backed trust governed by an independent board that included social workers, auditors, and, eventually, residents themselves. The model was studied, replicated. Slowly, Shelters stopped being treated as shadows and started being treated as infrastructure. Daniel was asked to sit on the advisory council. He said no at first, then yes when Lucas asked him why adults always complained but never helped fix things. Maria completed her program and was hired by the same organization that trained her. She brought Sophia to work sometimes, letting the baby nap in a sling while she helped other families find their footing. Lucas stopped being quiet. He grew taller. He learned the city not as a threat but as a map of possibilities. Ethan stayed away at first, unsure of his place now that the chaos had settled. When he finally returned one afternoon, no cameras followed. He walked into the courtyard and sat on the same bench he had months earlier. Daniel found him there. They shook hands, then laughed awkwardly, unsure how to bridge the distance time had built. "You look different," Daniel said. "So do you," Ethan replied. They talked about ordinary things. Work, school, weather. The rain came up, as it always did, but it no longer carried the same weight. It was just rain again. As dusk fell, Lucas ran over, older, louder, confident. "Mom says you're the guy from the story," he said. Ethan smiled. "I'm just a guy who stopped." Lucas considered that. "I think stopping is hard." "It is," Ethan agreed. "What happens now?" Lucas asked. Ethan looked around at the building, the lights turning on one by one, the sound of dinner being prepared inside. "Now you keep going," he said. "And when you see someone else in the rain, maybe you stop too." Lucas nodded seriously, as if storing the thought for later. Years passed. Ethan never returned to the life he'd had before. He lived smaller, quieter. He funded projects anonymously. He listened more than he spoke. Sometimes, when he walked through the city, he noticed families he might once have missed, and he wondered how many moments like that existed every day, waiting for someone to choose differently. On the anniversary of the night it all began, rain fell again, gentle this time. Ethan stood under an awning, watching people hurry by. Most didn't look up. A few did. One man slowed, offered his umbrella to a stranger without a word. Ethan smiled. Across town, Daniel tucked his children into bed. Maria turned off the lights. The building hummed softly with life, no longer fragile, no longer invisible. The world had not been fixed. It never would be. But somewhere between a red light and a soaked sidewalk, a crack had opened and through it, something human had grown. And that was enough to change everything.